Okay, so I think we can go ahead and get started. I just want to welcome everybody to day 5 of SABR Virtual. I'm your host for the day, Emily Hawks, and we have a really awesome program for you today. I'm really excited. On today's schedule, we have SABR President Mark Armour, who's going to be telling us who is the best player in baseball, who at any given point in time is not necessarily the person who had the best season that particular year, but if you were to find yourself at a sports bar, say in 1965, surrounded by smart baseball fans, who would everyone say was the best player? So Mark is going to try his best to answer this question for each of the past 146 years. After that, we will have Perry Barber, who will be talking about Maud Nelson and presenting a case for the consideration of her candidacy by the Hall of Fame Early Days Committee later this year. And then we will have a Q&A between myself and Dr. Lewis Moore, who is the Associate Professor of History at Grand Valley State University, as well as an accomplished author. And we will be discussing the intersection between civil rights and baseball. And then last up will be Dr. Roberta J. Newman, who will be presenting on Major League Baseball and the Marvel Universe and examining the Major League Baseball and Marvel commercial collaboration, as well as exploring the connection between baseball and superheroes from several angles. So before we get started, please know this session is being recorded and will be posted online on SABR's YouTube channel afterward. So if you do not wish to be recorded, you are free to leave the meeting now. In order for us to stay on time today, we will be taking all of our questions in the Zoom chat function on the side of your screen. So as you have questions, please type them into the chat window, and it would help me if you flag them in maybe big capital letters as a question, just so I can spot them. And then the speakers will have the chance to answer questions when their presentation is over, time permitting. And if I could also ask you all to mute your video if you are not presenting, that will help us save on bandwidth and also just reduce confusion as the speakers are sharing their presentations. And before we kick off, I also just want to give a quick plug for the SABR Virtual Raffle. For just $5, you can enter the SABR raffle and have a chance to win baseball memorabilia. So go to sabr.org/virtual-meetings and link to the raffle page, and winners will be announced on July 26th. So thank you very much for joining us for SABR Virtual, and we hope you enjoy the show. Leading off today, we have SABR President Mark Armour. Mark joined SABR in 1983, fresh out of kindergarten, as he likes to say. So Mark, I think we were almost in the same class. He started the Bio Project in 2002 and the Baseball Cards Committee in 2016, and then joined the Executive Board in 2018. Mark was also the recipient of the Bob Davids Award in 2008 and the Henry Chadwick Award in 2014. Mark's favorite SABR activity, though, has been presenting his research at chapter and national and now virtual meetings. So please enjoy Mark's presentation on the best player in baseball.
Thank you, Emily. So is this being shared?
Yes, you're good.
You see the share. Okay.
I do.
So sometime last fall, a friend asked me, when was the last time there was so much consensus as to who baseball's best player was? The consensus that Mike Trout is the best player has come about because so many of us are using the same prism. In 1965, people might have argued for Willie Mays or Roberto Clemente or Henry Aaron, and they all would have had fine reasons. When I was starting out a few years later, I thought Carl Yastrzemski was the best player, and my neighbor thought it was Frank Robinson. Both guys played for our favorite teams, coincidentally, and we never really got anywhere. Today, so many of us are using all-encompassing value metrics like WAR or win shares, and while there may be differences between them, they're all trying to determine the same thing. How valuable...
Hey, Mark. Sorry to interrupt, but would you mind clicking the presentation button just so we can see it full screen? Bottom left, it looks like the little, there you go. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, sorry. How valuable was a player to his team? What if, I wondered, we had always thought about the problem this way and had the same tools? Using today's mindset, who would smart Alex have considered the best player in 1965? Not who was the best player in that season, but who was the best player. The highest WAR, using baseball reference, in 2019 was put up by Cody Bellinger. And in 2018, it was Mookie Betts. But people kept saying that Mike Trout was the best player. My goal here is to create a model is to create a model that does not change based on a single year. If you become the best player, you stay the best player until you are decisively dislodged. What I settled on was the best player in 1965 was the player who had the most WAR over a 3-year period. I tried larger windows, but transitions took too long. Like Babe Ruth did not become the best until 1922. I tried weighing the recent season, but it seemed to overreact to a fluke year. So I settled for now on 3 years, unweighted. A few other notes. I use position players only. I'm not suggesting the best player cannot be a pitcher, but I find it more satisfying to consider them separately. I'm confident that Pop Lloyd and Oscar Charleston and Josh Gibson and others were as good or better than the best players in the major leagues for much of their careers. For now, I'm using the data that I have. It has become common in athletic circles to give a boost to catchers. Because catchers play shorter seasons and have shorter careers, without such an adjustment, catchers would never win any awards or get in the Hall of Fame. In reality, of course, they are well honored. In part, I believe, because we've always given catchers a bonus, even if subconsciously. If the player missed most or all of a year for military service, their 3-year window will just skip the war years, which seems sensible. On the other hand, no such consideration is given if the player is hurt. I think that this can be a mistake, and I will point that out later, a couple places where I think this trips me up. All 3-year WAR totals within 5% are considered to be a tie. That's only because I just don't want to be doctrinaire about any metric. So what would we have said using this model in 1965? We would have said, is Willie Mays, which doesn't really prove anything because it would be very difficult to develop any system that does not give this answer. So let's move on to many other seasons. But before I do, a word of warning. There are many great players, perhaps even your favorite player, who were never, in my opinion, and in this model's opinion, the very best player at any given time. You can still love them. So going all the way back to 1873, I start with 1873 because that's the first year that there was a 3-year window since the majors started in 1871. So in the 19th century, defense and base running were a much bigger part of the player's game. I am less confident in WAR's ability to figure out who the best players actually are. But Ross Barnes, pictured, had substantially the best stats of anyone in the National Association, and Deacon White, who just recently got in the Hall of Fame, in the early National League. I use a double asterisk to indicate that the player has at least a 20% gap over the field, which means that they are substantially the best player statistically. Dan Bruthers, Roger Connor, who's pictured, and Cap Anson at various times were the best player in baseball in the 1880s. Probably the biggest surprise here is Huey Jennings, who's pictured, who had extraordinary on-base percentages in this period, which may have been masked until much later when we started to care about that, largely thanks to his high hit-by-pitch totals. In 1896, to give one example, he hit .401 with 51 hit batters. Still, I think it's fair to say that through the 19th century, there were no Mike Trouts, no generational best players. That changed in the 1900s, or the 1900s, when we got our first Mike Trout. Every baseball fan in the 1900s knew who the best player was, and our modern reckoning has only amplified that conclusion. Ty Cobb would have been like Wagner were it not for a 1914 injury. Early in the 1914 season, Cobb pistol whipped a young man at a butcher shop, got arrested, and worse for this study, severely injured his thumb and missed 50 games. He was as good as ever in the other 100 games, but because I used 3-year windows, this injury actually ends up costing him the top spot 3 different times. This is perhaps unfair to Cobb. Once the window passed 1914, everyone knew he was the best player again, but I honestly don't have much sympathy for Ty Cobb. In the 1920s is, of course, Babe Ruth. Ruth had a down year in 1925, enough so that people wonder if he was on his way out. He was not. Hornsby's wars in this period were incredible, enough so that he would have dominated most every other decade. to summarize here, there's 6 years where it's Ruth and 4 years where it's either Ruth or Hornsby. 4 more years of Ruth, which if you're scoring at home means that for 14 consecutive seasons, Ruth had a case as the best player in the major leagues. The others listed are probably no surprise either. Ted Williams debuted in 1939, so he was first eligible here in 1941 when he catches DiMaggio. After that, he was the best player in the majors, went to the war for 3 years, and then came out and he was the best player in the majors for 4 more years. In fact, he remained the best or near the best for several years in the 1950s, but injuries, holdouts, and Korea kept him from putting together a 3-year stretch to get him back on the top in the 1950s. Integration had finally begun, and it did not take long for the game to change forever. A reminder that Jackie does not need credit as a pioneer to challenge Stan Musial as the best player in the game. I'm on the record as skeptical of the American League, more on this later, in this period, but no adjustment could diminish Mickey Mantle's extraordinary peak. Otherwise, Willie Mays had emerged as the best National League player and would soon take over the world. 1961, I should mention, is the only year that Hank Aaron appears on these slides as a candidate, which actually I think sums up Henry Aaron perfectly. He has the 5th highest career WAR among position players, and he appears in the top 5 in my study for 15 consecutive years. That is a superstar, even if he wasn't quite the best player, other than perhaps that 1 year. I need to take one more slap at the American League here. Mickey Mantle was the only AL player in the top 5 for several years, and for a few years in the 1960s, there were 0 AL players in the top 5. In 1963 and 64, the best AL player by my model was Bob Allison. In 1965, it was Jim Fregosi. That, my friends, is league imbalance. Willie Mays had the 3 highest 3-year WARs since Ruth and played in what might have been the best league ever. At the very end of the decade, my childhood opinion is confirmed, and you can keep your thoughts about league imbalance to yourself. More Yaz. Without a catcher bonus that I mentioned in my earlier slide, Johnny Bench's 1972 would be the only catcher that would have been number 1 in the 146 years. With a bonus, there are a few others, though still not that many. By the way, if you find a way to return to 1971, I would not recommend telling your friends that Sal Bando is actually the best player. That would probably not go well. After these 2 years, Bench was number 2 for 3 straight years with scores that would be number 1 in many other seasons, but he ran into a superstar in his own team. These 2 teammates are the only 2 to go 1-2 other than Ruth and Gehrig, who also did it several times. Mike Schmidt has these 2, and then 3 more with 1 a tie at the beginning of the 80s. Gary Carter's 3-year WARs are not as high as Bench, but he did not have to deal with Joe Morgan. Perhaps the biggest surprise in this whole set of slides I'm going to show you is Wade Boggs, who seems to be the obvious best player for a few years. He never won an MVP, nor did he ever receive an MVP first place vote. For this model, he had the foresight to pack all his excellent seasons in a row, as opposed to someone like Rickey Henderson, who had a better career arguably, but spread his great years around over a much longer period. In fact, Henderson was number 1 overall for the 1980s by 18% over Boggs, but does not appear on this slide. He does appear here. So the 1990s belong to Barry Bonds 1.0. Before my fellow Northwesterners, like Emily, hang up right now, there's a caveat here having to do with how I treat injuries, like I mentioned with Cobb. In 1995, Ken Griffey Jr. broke his wrist making a catch at the Kingdome and missed 3 months. Though Griffey had health problems later in his career, this was the only time he got hurt in his 11 years in Seattle. In fact, he was something of an Iron Man. He was a great player for several years, both before and after that injury. If I chose to simply ignore his 1995 season, just skip it entirely, he would have topped my model for both 1996 and 1997. You might think this is cheating, but in reality, I don't think an analyst at the time would have held this injury against Junior 1 or 2 years after he'd obviously returned to greatness. In both 1999 and 2000, Barry Bonds dropped out of the top 5, partly because of his own injury, though he was 33 and 34 years old at the time. But not so fast. He then became the only player in this study to leave the top 5 and then return all the way back to the top spot. This version of Barry Bonds 2.0, was a very different player, of course, and dominated the game for a few years. Alex Rodriguez, who looked poised to succeed Bonds in 2000, instead finished, other than those 2 ties, he then finished second for 6 consecutive seasons. The second half of the decade otherwise belonged to Albert Pujols, whose Anaheim years should not erase the player that he was in St. Louis, arguably the greatest first baseman of all time. More Pujols, and then a couple of transition years. Longoria and Cano might be a surprise, and then another multi-year king of baseball. Mookie Betts caught Trout in 2018 and was actually very close in 2019 as well, largely due to Trout's injuries. A dislocated thumb cost him 2 months in 2017, and a bad foot cost him a month in 2019. If he stays healthy, Trout is the front runner to remain on top. Here are the players who appeared the most times on the previous 15 slides. The top 4 are likely no surprise to anyone, even before I started speaking. Mike Trout has 6, and he's 28 years old. So if we can get through this current malaise and Trout stays healthy, I think he's got a good shot to move on to this slide. So this chart shows the players who finished in the top 5 in my model the most times. Tris Speaker is sort of an amazing story. He needed Cobb's 1914 injury that I talked about to get his 2 crowns, but he was a top 5 player for 16 consecutive seasons, spanning both the Cobb and Ruth eras. Speaker and Aaron are actually very similar, top flight stars year after year after year, even if there was usually someone slightly better hanging around. So I started by asking, when was the last time we had a player like Mike Trout, a multi-year best player in the game? Using 5 straight years in my model as the cutoff, here are the 6 Mike Trouts since integration. Willie Mays, Joe Morgan, Mike Schmidt, Barry Bonds, Albert Pujols, and Mike Trout himself. I can sense some of you thinking, what about Babe Ruth or Honest Wagner? Why are you leaving them off the chart? So I suppose I should explain that. In the first 3 decades, full decades of integrated baseball, the best player in my model was a person of color 15 times, half of the times. For ties, I count each of the players as 1/2, so it truly is 50% of the titles. In the second 3 decades after integration started, the number was 2/3, 20 of 30. So if baseball had never been segregated, how many times in the previous 30 years, which would be the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, how many times would that person have been a person of color instead of the person listed on my chart? Should that be 15? Or to be conservative, could that be 10? And if 10, which 10 years? So I'm simply not confident saying that anyone was the best player for any year before 1950, even Babe Ruth. If you think this is unfair, I've presented my data and you can treat it how you wish. But as an historian and a data scientist, I'm uncomfortable removing 30 or 40% of the stars from the league and then uncritically claiming that someone is the best player. Perhaps this is not fair to Babe Ruth or Honest Wagner, unquestionably great players, but they did okay for themselves. I'm trying to be fair to Oscar Charleston and many others. So that's where I am. We just don't know. Thank you for listening. Bravo to SABR. I'd be happy to take questions.
All right, nicely done, Mark. We do have a few questions coming in. So first, kind of early on, folks just were curious if you could clarify what source you were using for your WAR numbers.
Right. Okay. So I used Baseball Reference.
Okay, cool. And in terms of the scarceness of the AL players that we saw in the 60s and 70s, do you think this was due to superior AL pitching, or was it due to the fact that they were so far behind in integration?
I think it was probably mostly the latter, but I think maybe overall just incompetence. I mean, at the time, there was no draft, so the two leagues were competing equally against each other with no fair distribution. So the smartest owners were getting the best players, whether they be black or white. All of the best players, virtually without exception, were in the National League who were people of color. And I think if you removed all of those players, the National League might still have been better, to be honest. I mean, they had a lot of great white players as well. So I think it was pretty complicated, but I think overall, I think they just had better owners, better run teams. Mm-hmm.
Well, there are several people in the chat that are sharing my grievances about Ken Griffey Jr., so we'll just move on from that one. But
yeah, I totally hear you on that.
Tara and some others want to know if you will do a follow-up on the best pitchers maybe next year.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, I did the study for pitchers too, and at first I decided I was going to try and do them together, and it just got really messy, and I'm not tremendously confident in how we sort of divide wars between pitchers and hitters, which doesn't mean that it isn't done properly. It just means that I don't particularly get it. I'd have to educate myself. So then I separated them, and then I just thought that it was just too much data to go through in this talk. I actually have all the data, and I could either do it in a talk, or maybe if I write this into an article, I can put it all in there.
Stu wanted to know whether you would treat a player sitting out this year for COVID the same as you might for a military interruption.
You know, that's a question I was really hoping to never have to deal with when I first saw. I put in this abstract in February, so I didn't really see all of this coming, and I don't know how to handle 2020. It really messes up things. For a lot of ways, that's one of the ways it messes things up, but it's unfortunate. But I think probably yes. I think that's probably precisely what should happen, and in fact, honestly, think that should happen maybe for injuries as well, especially in the case of Griffey, and maybe, although I hate to say it, Cobb, if a player has an injury that does not make him injury prone, but it's something that he actually comes back from. Maybe I need to have a way to sort of factor that in. But I think I agree with Stu that if they don't play, then it's kind of a military thing.
Mm-hmm. We have one from Irvin Golfbarb who asked, for those of us who are not fans of analytics, can you explain why we need WAR and all of its hybrids to tell us that Cobb, Ruth, Mays, Bonds, and Pujols are transitional players of their era?
You don't need it. I mean, if you want to look at the game through a different prism and come to your own conclusions, I think that's totally fair. My talk is very transparently looking at value rankings using a particular lens. And if that is not a lens that you want to look through, then I would suggest that maybe this talk isn't for you, which is totally okay.
Were there any other metrics that you evaluated or that you considered when you were looking at this?
No, honestly. I mean, to be perfectly blunt, I mean, the main reason that I used WAR is because I have pretty easy access to all the data. So I thought it would be simple. I didn't think that if I used an all-encompassing metric, that it would matter that much. I expect that if I use, Fangraphs WAR, or if I use win shares, that there would be a few differences at the margins, but I think my overall conclusions would be pretty similar. And I admit that I didn't really test the claim I just made, but it's sort of what I believe.
Here's a question on who was the National League's best player in your study during Trout's reign as baseball's best player?
Let's see. So according to my data, I have for 2014, Buster Posey, 15 and 16, also Posey, 2017, Joey Votto, 2018, I don't know because the top 5 are all in the American League and that's all I listed. 2019, also all American Leaguers. So in 2019, as an example, the best 5 players I have in this model are Trout, Betts, Alex Bregman, Matt Chapman, and Aaron Judge. And if you go back, it's Altuve and Jose Ramirez and Lindor. So at the moment, the National League is a little bit of a lull when it comes to great players, although Lindor, Bellinger and Yelich obviously are going to be in the conversation if they have another year or two like they've had.
Mm-hmm. So we have a couple questions from Daryl Grigsby. First, other than Griffey's 95 injury, what were the other factors for him not being considered in that top class during his prime? And then second question, who was the most unexpected player you encountered?
Well, I mean, the Griffey had 2 issues. One is the injury, and I think that if he literally doesn't get injured at all, like if he does not run into the wall on that catch, and it was an extraordinary catch if you've ever seen the video, and he hurt his throwing hand bracing himself on the wall. If he had not been injured at all, and everything else had played out the same, he may have been the best player in this study for 3 years, because not just that year, but the 2 after. But his biggest problem was Barry Bonds, honestly. I mean, it's like what was Henry Aaron's problem? Henry Aaron's problem was Willie Mays. It's not really a problem. Ken Griffey was a great first ballot Hall of Famer who was one of the top 5 players in baseball for a decade and may have been the best player for a couple of years. I don't consider that really a problem exactly. I'm not trying to say that if like Frank Robinson, I didn't even mention his name in this talk, and Frank Robinson is a tremendous player, but sometimes it's the competition. I mentioned Boggs as possibly being a surprise because I lived in Boston during Boggs's entire career. I was living in Boston and went to a lot of games in that period. And I can tell you that the media and fans in Boston did not believe that Wade Boggs was the best player in baseball or anything like it. In fact, I'm pretty sure that if you'd asked people who the best player on the Red Sox was, they wouldn't have said it was Boggs. Because, Mike Greenwell got MVP votes in that period, so did Dwight Evans, so did Jim Rice. I mean, Boggs was not that people didn't think he was good, but just that he was good at things that we didn't necessarily value as much, because he hit 350 with walks, but Boston was used to power hitters, and he was not really a power hitter. So it took even in Boston a long time to. I think even when Boggs was getting near the end of his career, there was talk that he needed 3,000 hits to be a Hall of Famer, which I think is absurd. But I think Boggs might be the biggest surprise, at least from a multi-year guy.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're basically out of time. I just have one final question from Mike here. Any predictions on who's going to eclipse Trout?
I don't know. The problem with, let's assume for a second that baseball goes on as scheduled, and let's hope and assume that all of the great players in baseball are healthy and have the careers that we all want them to have. The problem that people have catching Trout is that Trout is their age. I mean, it's not like he's 35 and he's going to run out of steam. I mean, if Trout went away, I suppose it could be Mookie Betts, or it could be Alex Bregman. Bregman is probably, I think he's maybe a couple years younger than Trout. Obviously, Bregman's a great player, but Trout's he's a tough hurdle to pass. I think that we don't get Mike Trouts very often. So I wouldn't expect another Mike Trout exactly, just like I don't really expect another Willie Mays or another Joe Morgan anytime soon. But I hope Trout keeps going. But if I had to bet on somebody, if Trout decided to retire and become a teacher, maybe Mookie Betts would be the best bet.
All right. Well, thank you, Mark. That was an awesome presentation. A lot of good feedback in the chat window as well.
All right.
So
thank you, Emily, and thank you, SABR.
So as we switch over to Perry here, and Perry, you can go ahead and get set up. I just want to remind everybody about SABR's online raffle. So for a chance to win a lineup card autographed by Tony Gwynn, a vintage Hank Aaron figurine, and other baseball memorabilia prizes, go to sabr.org/virtual-meetings and find the online raffle bullet point. Winners will be announced on July 26th. All right, so next up we have Perry Barber. Perry has been umpiring since 1981 with close to 8,000 games under her belt by now. She and her twin sister Warren attended umpire school in 1982, and although Warren soon went back to doing regular things like being a registered nurse and raising 2 children, Perry has continued for 40 years and counting to umpire at all levels of the game, including Major League Spring Training in the US and Japan, the Cape Cod League, the Independent Atlantic League, and international tournaments in Guam, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and the Caribbean. In addition to her own duties on the diamond, Perry advocates for other women to join the ranks of umpires, training them and offering opportunities to umpire tournaments she assigns, such as Baseball for All Nationals, which is the largest all-girls baseball tournament in the country, and the Boston Red Sox Women's Fantasy Camp. One young woman she helped train, Emma Charlesworth-Seiler, became only the 8th woman to umpire in affiliated minor league baseball in 2017. Emma is now an instructor at one of the 2 pro umpiring schools, changing the culture of professional baseball at its incubation from one of dismissal and disdain towards women to one where they're viewed not as threats, but as assets. Perry also conducts umpiring clinics and does a lot of public speaking about umpiring in women's baseball. She currently serves as a board member for the International Women's Baseball Center, director of women's services for the Association of Professional Baseball Players, and an advisor for Baseball for All. Plus, as a one-time Jeopardy champion and former opening act for Bruce Springsteen and Billy Joel, this is quite the bio, Perry. During her sordid past as a wandering troubadour, she's still milking those credentials for all they're worth, 45 years later. So today, Perry is going to be presenting 2 is better than 1, making the case for Maude. So as the Early Days Committee gears up to consider candidates for election to the Hall of Fame this year, Perry is advocating for the inclusion in that group of Maude Nelson, whose prowess as a pitcher during the late 19th century and early 20th century drew large, cheering crowds to the ballpark and brought her great acclaim. But it's Maude's executive and entrepreneurial skills as the driving force behind the creation and promotion of dozens of teams and leagues, offering paying jobs to women ball players all over the world during the 20s and 30s that placed her squarely and equally in the company of other candidates, also under consideration for induction in 2021. This is Maude's story. I'll pass it over to you, Perry.
Thank you, Emily. You hear me okay?
Yep.
Can you hear me? Okay, great. And thank you, Mark, for taking that revolutionary position that it's impossible to determine relative value because of the absence of Black ball players. Really appreciate your saying that. That's an important discussion to get into. So you are a tough act to follow, but here goes. So I click share screen and let's see. I don't see my presentation on the screen here. Why not? Firefox post attendees. Let me see.
Yep, when you click
Okay.
share, you want to choose PowerPoint.
Yeah, I don't see it coming up when I click share screen. The only
There we
thing
go.
that
We got it.
comes up is my.
We see it now.
Oh, okay.
So just make sure you click
Oh.
the presentation button in the bottom right-hand corner there, and then it'll be good. There you go.
Bottom right.
That's good. Yeah.
Where it says show?
Oh, you're good. You could do it your
No.
way. There's two different buttons.
Okay, but I can't see it now. Where is it?
Here, Perry, this is Scott. I was sharing my screen with your presentation. So I'll just do that and you can tell me when to click to the next slide, okay?
Okay, I can't see or switch anything right now, so I'm not seeing.
All right, you just
myself.
tell me when
There.
to change slides.
Okay, all right, there we go. Is there any way I can do it? I think, let me see. No, that's not working. Okay, I'll let you know. It's very easy. So the title of my presentation, Two is Better Than One, is both a stealth homage to my identical twin sister, Warren. You can click. Next slide. There we go. That's Warren on the right, and Harry Wendelstedt on her left, and Randy Marsh, number 30, on the left, and me there. So my identical twin sister, Warren, who was my first steady umpiring partner when no one else would work with me in 1981, the summer of the strike, and as well as to what for me is the very sad fact that among the 333 Hall of Fame inductees, there's only one woman, Effa Manley, and my premise here is that there should be two. And the second one should be Maud Nelson because of her long career as a baseball scout and executive who created and ran an industry that made it possible for women to play baseball all over the world and get paid for it during the early 20th century. And this was after she'd enjoyed a decades-long career as a pitcher who was hugely popular and drew large enthusiastic throngs to the ballpark wherever she played. So this is Maud's story. Next slide, please, Scott. Here she is in her full glory as a pitcher for men's teams and women's teams like the Cherokee Indians ball team, the Boston Bloomer Girls, and the Western Ranger Girls. And a lot of those teams were basically franchises that Maud went on to model her own leagues and teams that she organized on that pattern. So, I mean, and they had some very politically incorrect names, but that's for another presentation. Next slide, please. She has her own Wikipedia entry, pretty much thanks to a great researcher, Barber, whose dogged research, and I mean really dogged, she tracked Maud down in Watervliet, Michigan, with another name. And her research provides a lot of the information that's available about Maud, along with that of SABR's own Leslie Heafy. Thank you very much, Leslie. Jean Ardell and Susan Johnson, as well as Gay Burlage and Irina Kovac. Next slide, please, Scott. So Maud arrived at Ellis Island as a 14-year-old immigrant girl in 1895. This is the passenger ship list where she's listed fourth from the top, I believe, as Clem Breda, sixth, I think. Clementina Breda was her given name as she was growing up in the southwestern Austrian or northern Italian Tyrolean mountains, not really sure. But she spent her remaining teenage years in Mahoney City, Pennsylvania, a small coal mining town that nevertheless spawned at least two major leaguers, one of whom was Joe Dugan, not Jimmy Dugan, who played for the Athletics in 1917, and Jack Stivitz, who pitched for the American Association St. Louis Browns and the National League Boston Beaneaters and Cleveland Spiders during the 1890s. Stivitz is credited with teaching Maud how to pitch. He also taught another famous girl ball player, Lizzie Arlington, also known as Elizabeth Stride, who is generally regarded as the first woman to play for a professional baseball team. Maud and Lizzie actually pitched for the same team, the all-female Cincinnati Reds, 2 years in a row during the early 1890s. Next slide, please, Scott. 2 years after she came to the United States, she was already pitching professionally for the Boston Bloomer Girls, named after the famed Amelia Bloomer, whose innovative ideas about uniforms for women athletes made it possible for them to compete without the inconvenience of hoop skirts, petticoats, and long dresses. 5 years later, by the time she was 20, she had married John Olson, who became her partner in her many baseball ventures, as did her second husband, Constantin John Delacroix. Maud learned about financing and promoting herself and her teams from both of her husbands. She chose well. Some of us don't, but she did, apparently. Next slide, please, Scott. Here she is looking pretty fierce, even as what looks like a very young pitcher. Thank you. Next slide. And Maud was a fantastic promoter of the women's game, and she would place articles in newspapers, arrange for parades and citywide celebrations wherever she played. And she just created huge buzz about her exploits, laying the groundwork for her later incarnation as an executive who formed leagues and teams for other women to play on and get paid. Next slide. I love that. Clean, moral, and refined. Yeah, I'd love to find out if that was true. Nobody ever was clean, moral, or refined around me when I was umpiring. So come and see the famous girl pitcher, Maud Nelson, there at the bottom of that poster. Wonderful. Next slide, please. By 1911, she was using her cachet as a pitching sensation to assemble other women's teams, starting with the Western Bloomer Girls, which was the first of many she would organize, own, and operate throughout her life. Yeah, a lot of them. So, next slide, please. And here we see a poster advertising one of the teams for which she pitched and played third base, the Star Bloomer Girls. She was paying attention all the time and formulating her own ideas about how to recruit, train, and run women's teams and leagues. Next slide. Here's one of Maud's better known finds, the astonishing Edith Houghton, known as the Kid, because you can probably see why. The Kid. Edith had a remarkable life that will be the subject of Cat Williams' next book, as soon as she gets off of the virtual road promoting her current book about Lefty Alvarez, who was one of a handful of Cuban women to play in the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League. And I can't wait for that one because Edith was such a rock star. She served in the Navy, became the first female major league scout for the Phillies in the 1950s. And she just tore up the pea patch wherever she went throughout her life. Edith played for the Bobbies as a very young girl. That's the uniform she's wearing in this picture. And then she played for Maud when she was a youngster. One of Edith's teammates on the Bobbies, Leona Carnes, was on a playing tour of Japan when the money ran out, sort of an old tale. And this very young girl and several of her teammates were abandoned there by their manager, Eddie Ainsmith, who had played for the Washington Senators. Leona managed to secure passage on an ocean liner back to the US, but during that trip was swept overboard and drowned. Maud had heard of that incident and was consequently very protective of the girls who played for her. She cared about them. She didn't just regard them as business propositions or ways for her to aggrandize herself or make money. She really cared about them. Before she even signed Edith, she sent a letter to Edith's parents reassuring them that nothing like what happened to Leona Kearns would ever happen under her watch. And as far as we know, it didn't. So next slide, please. Another of Maud's find was Rose Gatchak. Thank you for the pronunciation guide, Leslie, who went on to play for several teams in the AAG PBL, including the fabled Rockford Peaches, one of the teams featured in the Penny Marshall Classic, A League of Their Own. Rose is generally regarded as one of the best players the league ever had during its 11-year existence. So we see how Maud's influence extends well into the mid-20th century when we talk about Rose Gatchak. Next slide, please. Here is a schedule for the All-Star Ranger girls, one of the teams on which Rose played. And you can see it's not exactly made out for dainty, delicate flowers. Those women played every day, sometimes double headers after a night game. And of course, we all know the AAG PBL staged the first night game at Wrigley Field in 1943, 45 years before the Mets played the Cubs there, right? Yeah, for their All-Star game that summer, they had a night game. So next slide, please. Thank you, Scott. So here is Margaret Giselo, another of Maud's proteges, who went on to become a tennis and dance and agility instructor at Arizona State University, the alma mater of 37 major league players, including Hall of Famer Reggie Jackson, who took classes with Professor Giselo, learning agility skills they applied to their baseball exploits as Sun Devils and then pros. So, by extension, Maud's influence has permeated the Major League Baseball universe via Reggie and Bob Horner and Lenny Randall and more than 30 players who studied under Margaret and undoubtedly taught some of what they learned from her to their own acolytes and students. So there is a real 6 degrees of separation from Maud even on into today. It's pretty remarkable. Here's another look at Margaret during her playing days when she was known as the girl Babe Ruth. Wow, for her batting prowess. Okay, next slide. And here she is later in life as the head of the dance department at Arizona State. Looks pretty legit to me. So next slide, please. So we see how Maud's entrepreneurial skills and influence on a succeeding generation of ball players has carried over well into the late 1970s, almost a century after her arrival here in the United States. She continued to pitch well into the 1930s. She was in her 50s by the time she actually quit, while she was also building her women's baseball empire. And this team, the Ranger Girls, is one of her later teams, at which point she'd been in the baseball business for more than 40 years. World's greatest female baseball team. Don't miss it. Albion, Pennsylvania. Man, that was minor league baseball. Next slide. In 1944, Maud died of a heart attack at age 63, pretty young, in her home near Wrigley Field, where she and her second husband, Constantine John Delacroix, had lived for many years, hosting a sort of constant open house for any ball player who found his or her way there. She'd spent more than 40 years as a player, owner, scout, executive, and impresario. Yet, as the comment here so poignantly points out, despite all of her accomplishments, her entire life is summed up in 2 sentences. And one of them, applying the Bechdel test to baseball, is of course about a man. So she really only got one all to herself. But that's just me being obtuse. So next slide, please. So back to Maud Nelson protege Margaret Giselo for a moment, and a list of the 37 major league players to whom she taught dance and agility while they played at ASU, courtesy, as you see, of Sean Foreman's amazing resource, baseballreference.com. Next slide. I couldn't fit them all on one page. So There are some pretty impressive names on that list. Ricky Nelson, all right. Craig Swan, Lenny Randall, a lot of Mets. And Ken Phelps, who was quite a joke on Seinfeld, if anybody remembers George tirades about Ken Phelps. Anyway, they all were influenced by Maud Nelson all the way down that line. So next slide, please. So now that we know a little bit about Maud Nelson and the far-reaching influence she wields over a number of Major League ball players through Margaret Giselo and the ASU dance department, I want to talk for a couple of minutes about Maud's chances of being elected to the Hall of Fame by the Early Days Committee, which meets this fall and announces its vote at the winter meetings in December, wherever they will be. The rules about eligibility are pretty strict, but interpretations of existing ones can be used, I believe, to support Maud's case rather than scuttle it. Next slide, please. This year, candidates from the early years before 1950 are competing with candidates from the golden days, 1950 to 1969, for the 10 slots open for consideration by the, next slide, please, by the Historical Overview Committee, which will call the candidates for the Early Days Committee to then review and vote on. So what this means is that the number of slots open to either of those two groups, Early Days or Golden Days, has been essentially cut in half. And it also means Maud is vying for one of those 10 slots with Gil Hodges, which breaks my heart because I'm hoping mightily Gil will also make it in this time after several attempts, but we'll have to wait and see what happens. It's always a thriller right up until the announcements are made. So next slide, please. Voting shall be based upon the individual's record, ability, integrity, sportsmanship, character, and contributions to the game. And no, I'm not snickering a little. If Maud doesn't make it into that group because of everything she did and made possible for baseball, including Major League Baseball, who does? That's what I'd like to know. Next slide, please. So here is where the eligibility rules can be interpreted to support Maud's case for induction as an executive. The rule says players must have played in the major leagues for 10 years, but it doesn't specify that executives must have served in the major leagues. And there are instances of at least 2 elected Hall of Famers whose careers as baseball executives began and ended before there even was a Major League Baseball. Most notably, probably Alexander Cartwright, who is generally inaccurately credited as being the father of baseball when it was really more likely that it was somebody named Doc Lucius Adams, who hasn't been elected either. And the other one is Candy Cummings, whose election to the Hall as an executive after his brief pitching career was over, pretty brief, owes more to his being tagged as the inventor of the curveball than to his skills or accomplishments as an executive. Next slide, please. So because of this rule, Janet Marie Smith of the Dodgers, whose vast influence on the economics of the game through her innovative ballpark designs, she worked on Camden Yards, the restorations of Fenway Park and Dodger Stadium and others, a lot of minor league parks, and her innovations have generated millions, I mean, untold millions in income for those clubs, but she isn't eligible for consideration, at least not yet, because she's not retired. She's still an active executive with the Dodgers, and she's too young. Woe is her. But hang in there, Janet. She will hit 70 one of these days. It's creeping up on me, that I know. So thank you. Next slide, please, Scott. So I love this little cover our asses caveat. That's what we say in umpiring lingo, about on-field activities being more important than off-the-field ones when considering the viability of candidates for election. It's sort of funny or ironic when we consider all of the scoundrels and rakes who have been elected and weigh them against candidates like Gil Hodges, who lived an exemplary life on and off the field, but just hasn't garnered the support he needs to finally crack the hall. But perhaps 2021 will be the year we finally see both him and only the second woman ever to be elected enshrined at the induction day ceremonies next year. That is my goal. So I want to thank everybody and SABR for giving me your time and attention as I make the case for Maud's entry into that hallowed, if not exactly holy, and certainly most human assemblage of baseball influencers. And the last slide, please. Or was that it? I think that was it. And thank you to all of the intrepid women researchers of SABR, whose writings are the foundation of my case for her election. And most of all, to the great and hopefully obscure no longer, Maud Nelson. Thank you.
That was awesome, Perry. Thank you. So we have time for probably a couple of questions here. One coming from one of the intrepid women researchers that you mentioned, Leslie Heafy. she wonders if you could talk a little bit about why it was so hard to track Maud down with all of her different names.
It was a puzzle that had a lot of missing pieces, and Barbara had to connect a lot of dots. I'm talking about Barbara Grigorich, who did all of the legwork, or a lot of the legwork, going to places where Maud was known to have played, where there were records of, you know, posters and newspaper accounts. And I mean, there is just, even as obscure as she became, and probably still is, at least until right now, there's still a vast archive of documents about her, just not about her early life over in Europe. As far as I know, although I'd be really interested to know, you know, did she just suddenly glom onto baseball over here because she met Jack Stivetts, or how it came about that she just decided, I mean, it seems at such a young age, that this was going to be her American dream. And I just absolutely love that about her, that, you know, a teenager could decide that for herself and make it happen at that time in human history. I just really have to give her a lot of credit. And to the historians like Leslie and Barbara, who put all of those, connected all of those dots and made it very easy for me to figure some way to propose her as a candidate for election. So I owe them a lot.
I guess kind of related to that, maybe we can wrap up with this question. Who do we need to lobby to get Maud added to the ballot?
I believe the fellow who is the head of the Historical Overview Committee is Bill DeWitt at the Hall of Fame. I'm not sure, but I will find out for sure. And if anybody wants to join me in pressing Maud's case, I would just be thrilled beyond measure. And you can find me on Twitter at Perry Barber. My name, PerryBarber. So just tweet at me, and yeah, we'll unite. In unity, there is strength and persuasion. So I would love all the help I can get. That's just fabulous to offer to do that. Appreciate it.
Well, that's great, and it seems like, you know, with your presentation here, I think you've gotten a lot more supporters. So I think we can get a little SABR army going to.
I was hoping that would be the result.
Great. All right. Well, thank you so much, Perry. That was awesome.
And thank you for all of your help, Emily. I really appreciate it. You were just fabulous. All of you, everybody at SABR. Just love doing these Zoom meetings with everybody. Just such a pleasure. You know,
it's a whole new world.
For me, it's my baseball now, because I've pretty much made a decision that I'm not going to go back to work, at least until next year, when I feel less concerned about my own safety and health, and everybody else's too.
Right.
So,
great.
anyway,
All
thank
right.
you. And
thank you, Perry.
And Thank you. And Roberta, you'll be wonderful. I know it. So.
All right. So switching gears here, and I guess as we switch over, just want to give one more plug for the SABR online raffle. So again, I encourage you to log on to sabr.org/virtual-meetings and link to that raffle page and enter to win. And winners will be announced on July 26th. All right, so next up, I am thrilled to introduce Dr. Lewis Moore. Dr. Moore is an associate professor of history at Grand Valley State University. He teaches African American history, civil rights, sports history, and US history. His research and writing examines the interconnections between race and sports. He's the author of 2 recently published books, I Fight for a Living, Boxing and the Battle for Black Manhood, 1880 to 1915, and We Will Win the Day, the Civil Rights Movement, the Black Athlete, and the Quest for Equality. And I have to say, I just read it. It's really good. I definitely recommend people check this out. So a plug for that. He's also written for a number of online outlets, including the Shadow League, Vox, and Vocative, and has appeared on news outlets including NPR, MSNBC, and BBC Sports, talking about sports and race. Very recently, he released an Audible original audiobook titled African American Athletes Who Made History, which has literally been topping multiple charts on Audible, so congratulations on that. And you can follow him on Twitter with the handle @LouMoore12. And I would also encourage you all to check out his podcast, which is titled The Black Athlete. So thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Moore, and welcome.
Oh, thank you for having me.
So just to get started, I'm curious, what initially inspired you to explore the intersection of race and sports?
Oh, I was an undergrad. I always loved sports. I always loved race. I just didn't know you could study it. And I was at Sac State, so Cal State Sacramento. It was our senior thesis, and we had to write about California history. And I was going through stuff, and the only thing I wanted to do was sports. So luckily, I had a professor that let me do it and worked with me. So originally, I was going to do something on Negro League Baseball, but I just couldn't get the sources at that time. So we settled on doing something on boxing. So the Jack Johnson, Jim Jeffries fight of 1910, which was originally scheduled in California. So I just did it from that angle. And then from there, writing that paper got me into grad school. And so it was just a battle with traditional history program. So just battling to say, look, sports is a good way to look at race, and convincing my other professors to let me do this in a traditional, U.S. history program. So it worked out.
That's awesome. So I know you specialize in a lot of different sports, but obviously we have kind of a baseball focus here. And, Major League Baseball has kind of championed itself as sort of a trailblazer in the civil rights movement, and in particular through the achievements of Jackie Robinson. However, the depiction of this whole movement is often portrayed through a fairly narrow and often white lens. So what are some common misconceptions about baseball during the era of integration, and what do you wish more people knew about that era?
It's a great question. I think on the latter part, I wish they knew what I was fascinated in too, and that is just the stories of guys who aren't Jackie Robinson or can't be, or the guys who made it, like the guys who didn't make it, like what happened to them. And a great example is, so I was writing this book, and when I was researching this book, I just got a bunch of black newspapers, stuff that wasn't online, just microfilm, and I would read it. And there's one player that the Dodgers signed in '47, a high school kid out of Detroit. I believe it's Sammy G, a great athlete. And then he busts out, right? He goes to minor league, he busts out. But these are the stories, because it's a story not, that doesn't cover this grand story, this trailblazer. It's just a guy who had to be, an 8-year-old kid had to be on his own in minor league. Other stuff is just black fandom. I think if we had a story of black fandom that was equal to Jackie Robinson, we would see a different discussion on baseball, on what it looked like. And I think there was a time, if we could go back to like that year, I mean, black fans were there. I mean, they were there for Jackie's, they're half the stadium for Jackie's games. I mean, the St. Louis Browns signed black players just to get black fans. And now when we talk about baseball, we always ask, well, what happened to the black fans? And I think part of that is because we never talked about the black fans, and we never pumped it up and made them part of this game.
Right. Right. Yeah, there are so many aspects that I think don't get the attention and coverage that they deserve. And one of them was a player that you had written a piece on. So, I think a lot of times when we hear about Jackie Robinson's legacy and the integration of baseball, it's kind of portrayed as this sort of monolithic event that happened all at once, where white allies like Branch Rickey and Pee Wee Reese are kind of central to the story, and black activists of the era really aren't given nearly enough credit. And also the fact that baseball wasn't fully integrated for 12 more years, and spring training took even longer than that. So you had written a piece on Bill Bruton and his contributions to the integration movement. And his isn't a name that's commonly credited in a lot of the history books. So could you share a bit about his story?
Yeah, so the piece is online at the African American Intellectual Historical Society, and it's just really about that, like you said, the complete story of integration. It was one of those things when I was writing the book that didn't make the book because there was just no room. I wanted to an opportunity to talk about housing, but I just ran out of space. I was like, well, let me come back to this later. And Breton, as you said. He was the one, he becomes the leader of Black players, so to speak, as they push for complete integration. What I mean by that is when they go to spring training outside of the Dodgers up until 61, 62, all those places in Florida are segregated. And Black players, they were tired of this by the civil rights movements going on, and we're looked at as heroes in our community. Yet what you guys don't see is that when we go to spring training in February and March, we're segregated just like you. And for someone like Bill, it stung because in Milwaukee, he's treated like a hero, right? He's the quote unquote good Black that everybody loves. Like when he got traded, there was the governor said something, and they want to keep his house in Milwaukee. Like they loved him, but when he left that, when he traveled, he said in a sport, or not Sports Illustrated, but in a sport article, right? When he's traveling around the Midwest, like he can't get a place to stay, he can't get a place to eat. And the same thing happens in the South. And collectively, these baseball players said, no, we're not going to take this. And so one of the things that's fascinating to me, and I think applies to this day, is that he realized that those professional teams had so much power in the South that they could shift Jim Crow. Right. And what he was doing, he was calling them out. You've been complacent all this time and hiding behind Jim Crow laws, but you have the power, the economic power to change. And baseball finally said, oh yeah, you're right, we do, right? And so magically, like Detroit Tigers are second to last team to integrate, and they're the last team to integrate their facilities in Florida. But that's part of the story of baseball that doesn't get told, right? We get Jackie, if we're lucky, we get Pumpsy, very few in between, or Dobie, but very few in between. And then we leave out what's going on in Florida, we leave out what's going on in Arizona, and we definitely leave out what's going on throughout the South with minor league baseball.
Right, right. And another powerful entity at the time that which you touched on earlier was the Black press. And I think a lot of times when we think about baseball integration, we're kind of focused on stories of people inside baseball itself, whether it's the players or the front office executives. But I think the Black press obviously had a lot to do with the trajectory of the integration movement as well. So can you talk a little bit about how baseball fit into their Double B campaign and sort of the impact that the Black press had?
Right. So Double B is, in case the listeners aren't aware, that it comes from the Black press. It comes from the Pittsburgh Courier during World War II, and it's essentially this idea that Black Americans are going to fight a double V campaign. That is to say, victory abroad, victory at home at the same time. So we're gonna fight for democracy abroad, but we're getting it at home. And so sports becomes integral during the war and especially after the war. And so there's a ton of stories about integration. But part of that, how you push for integration, is to point to Black soldiers and say, wait a minute, there's guys dying for democracy, and yet they can't be part of Major League Baseball. How could this happen? And so you would see in 45 in New York, for example, and you could Google image this, but there are Black folks and white folks picketing baseball with signs, referencing this idea that there are, Black people fighting in segregated troops, but they can't play Major League Baseball. And then you have a number of writers, right? I think 42 does Wendell Smith, doesn't do it enough, but you know, it's the black writers who are getting guys like Jackie Robinson a tryout, whether it's for Boston, or it's my favorite at that time, Joe Bostic. I say he's my favorite. So he writes for the People's Voice, which I believe is online. When I was researching the book, I didn't have it online, so I just got the microfilm, and I got every sports page I could from them. And he's very, how do I put this, very, very left in his politics. It's not saying this is a bad thing, but you know, it's a working class, it's a black working class newspaper. And my favorite story is the story that gets told sometimes is him bringing black players to spring training to force the Dodgers to integrate, and Branch Rickey just being upset. But even before that, he's using his platform to really attack not only the Dodgers, but the Yankees and the Giants. And so like when I was writing this book, and like he's like one of my heroes, like trying to model this book after, like what would Joe Bostic say about sports, right, between 45 and 1968. So he's just one of the names that's essential to the story of baseball.
Yeah, and I guess I also want to go back to another group that you mentioned earlier, the black fans. So, you know, I know in your book you mentioned that there were civil rights leaders who really felt the best way to accelerate change was through green power, so basically the money of black consumers. So can you share some of the ways in which things like boycotts actually impacted the trajectory of the civil rights movement in baseball?
Yeah, one of the stories, and one of the most probably untold stories in baseball, is it comes from New Orleans. So the Louisiana Weekly is the local weekly black newspaper there. That's one of them, but it's the most powerful one. And they have a writer there who galvanizes the community and starts a boycott of the Pelicans. So they had in New Orleans, they had a baseball team that at first it was part of the Pirates organization. I think then late 50s it switches to the Yankees. But what happens in Louisiana specifically is that they pass a sports ban, or integrated sports ban. So early 1956, you have the Sugar Bowl. It's the first integrated Sugar Bowl. Pitt brings one black player. And after that, the White Citizens Council, which is like the modern KKK, takes over the legislation, and they pass a sports ban. And black fans have had it, right? They don't have any black players on a team. In fact, the Pirates have a few black players in the minor league system, but the Pelicans don't bring any of them on. And then when you combine that with the sports ban, you have the black newspaper writers, and then you have black fans starting a boycott. And that boycott lasts nearly 5 years. And it's one of the reasons, if you look at the local newspapers, it's one of the reasons why the Pelicans, it's the main reason why the Pelicans are shut down, because they lose that black dollar. And it's the black fans who have said, look, you have no players, you put us in Jim Crow, we're not giving you our money anymore. And a lot of the Southern League worked like that, right? Black fans just stopped going to the games, and teams had to fold. And that's that power that they hold. And you'll see that throughout the South. You'll see that a little bit on the West when it comes to other sports like football, and the Washington football team trying to integrate. And eventually they'll get Ernie Davis. But that's the story of the power of black fans.
Yeah, it's definitely something that doesn't get enough attention. And I think another really powerful example in your book was really what you led off the book with in terms of player protest, and it's something that really we're seeing, you know, echoes of it today, where we've seen the pregame national anthem become really a central focus of protests and backlash against the protesters. So your book leads with a story about James Mudcat Grant and a protest 60 years ago, which really closely parallels what we've observed in the sporting world more recently. So could you talk a little bit about his story and maybe compare that with what we're seeing in the last few years?
Yeah, I think his story is important. So I was writing this book. I was closing it out, right? I was writing it in 2016. So it's almost all done. And then boom, cap happens. I was like, oh gosh, what are we gonna do here? And then I had this Mudcat story. And it's a fascinating story. It's fascinating because it's a one-off thing. It's not like he continued this protest throughout. And it's not like a lot of people remember it, but essentially it was they're playing the national anthem. It's a home game in Cleveland. And he changes the lyrics of the national anthem a bit. And he says, "This land ain't so free, I can't even go to Mississippi." Upon hearing that, his pitching coach, who escapes my name at this moment, is a white Southerner from Texas who's overtly racist, it appears that he does call him the N-word, and they get into this verbal altercation about, the anthem and freedom. And eventually Jim Grant just leaves the stadium. At the end of the day, he's suspended for the final 2 weeks of the season. But what's important about it is that the black press see this and they're, oh, finally, we have another Jackie Robinson. And what they mean by that is not Jackie Robinson, the player, but Jackie Robinson, the activist, Jackie Robinson, the black athlete who's going to stand up and say something. And at that time in 1960, there's very few, right? Elgin Baylor in basketball was known for, he boycotted the game in West Virginia because of Jim Crow, and they compared him to Jackie Robinson. You see a little bit of Bill Russell, but Mudcat's story stands out because they were like, this is something that Jackie would do. Like this makes us proud. And there was also this, oh my gosh, here it's finally coming, right? And I think you get the sense that the black press and black folks in general were waiting for the black athlete to do something, to say something. And you have this one-off in Grant. Eventually you'll get more involved, but not everybody, right? Someone like Willie Mays, it's no knock on Willie Mays, but Willie Mays was one of those people who just, believed that as long as I play, right, as long as I'm nice, things will come eventually to other black folks. And someone like a Jackie Robinson was like, no. Speaking about the anthem protests, Jackie Robinson was famous, and I never had it made saying like, look, I don't stand for the anthem anymore, right? I'm a black man in America. And I think that's important to point out in the conversations that we have about CAP, or we have about athletes protesting. Like, baseball is part of this story. So when you see someone like a Bruce Maxwell a couple of years ago, our players today trying to deal with what's going on with the murder of George Floyd or the protests across the country, I think baseball players should know that they are part of this history, and they shouldn't shy away from it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that is interesting, I guess, in terms of how we're kind of seeing things evolve right now. So, obviously in recent years, we've been seeing an increasing amount of activism from players and coaches in other sports, especially in the way that they leverage social media. So, like LeBron James or Greg Popovich in the NBA, for example. But we haven't really seen as much of this in the MLB until very recently, especially after the murder of George Floyd. And now we're starting to see players like Ian Desmond sharing his very personal experiences of racism on Instagram and really explaining how those experiences have informed his perspective, including his decision to opt out of playing this year. So now that we're starting to see some more players more freely expressing themselves in the sport, where maybe expressing one's own opinions has kind of historically been stifled, whether directly or indirectly, by sort of the culture of baseball. You talk in your book about the power of an overall movement and how a movement can really create room for activism in sports. So given the patterns that you've observed throughout history, how do you think baseball will evolve as a result of the present movement?
I think it's gonna change for the better. I think athletes, not just black athletes, but Votto has that Black Lives Matter shirt on the other day. I think athletes are gonna feel more comfortable speaking out. Baseball is a very almost seems, as an outsider looking at, very close to some of this stuff. And we saw that even during Jackie's career. Like, to be clear, a lot of people didn't like Jackie Robinson because he spoke out. There's this time we talked about Louisiana when they passed that sports segregation law. A writer in New Orleans blamed Jackie Robinson because he was always speaking out, right? And I think I bring that up because if you're the lone guy, if you're Jackie Robinson or you're Bruce Maxwell, kneeling, you take a lot of everybody's anger, right? But if you're one of many, you're fine, right? And I think that's what you'll see in the early 1960s. It takes a Elgin Baylor, then a Bill Russell, then a Mudcat Grant, and then eventually you get Floyd Patterson, Kurt Flood, and others part of the movement, right? And I think that's what you see now. You have people out on the streets, right, protesting all over America. And now all of a sudden, you're not just out there, right? You're not out there risking your endorsements, or you're not getting a lot of. I'm not saying you wouldn't get hate mail, but you're not getting as much because you're just part of the movement. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what you saw with these baseball players a couple of weeks ago. They realized, oh, we have some cover now. And let's do something. They formed their own alliance, right? Black players formed like the Players Alliance. Right. So I think that's part of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's kind of a related question coming from Scott Bush in the chat pod about how Jackie Robinson has really been positioned by baseball as sort of this singular force. And do you think this discouraged others from speaking up by creating this type of isolationism?
Oh, that's a good question. I think by not celebrating all of who Jackie was, I think it suppresses that, right? What I do when I teach, or even when I do the shameless plug to Audible, which is free, by the way, for the month if you're a subscriber, is really positions Jackie Robinson as a civil rights icon, right? His book, First Class Citizenship, which you can get, has his letters and his writings about this stuff. But Jackie's, out there publicly about police brutality, and I think that's important to say. Like, baseball had the first athlete out there publicly talking about police brutality. And this is something that they're not sharing with the world. They should be like, this is who Jackie Robinson was, right? Jackie was talking about anti-lynching campaigns. Jackie was in Birmingham. Jackie was talking about housing. He was talking about economics. He had his, he helped start a bank, right? These are the stories that Major League Baseball should share of Jackie Robinson, so you get more Jackie Robinsons. So it's not necessarily the punishment. I think it's just not the celebration.
Right. Yeah, and it definitely seems to have some correlation with the drastic drop in representation of Black American players over the last few decades as well, where we saw just under 20% of the league being Black Americans in the early 80s to dropping just around 7% last year. So I guess, what's your take on this, and what do you think baseball should be doing to address this?
Right. I'll start with mentioning that Eric Davis is the greatest player ever, and I can't believe he wasn't in that first presentation. It should all say, from about mid '80s to the early '90s, should all say Eric Davis. But anyway, the story is, Ralph Wiley, the late Ralph Wiley, has one of the most fantastic sports writing pieces ever. It's on Eric Davis. It's you can find it on the Sports Illustrated archive. For free online, right? And he talks about Davis and Davis's upbringing in Los Angeles, where he plays with Darryl Strawberries and comes from Fremont. But I bring that up because, look, Davis's dad wants him to go play Little League baseball in the suburbs, but he can't. The reason why he wants him to play Little League, because there's not a Little League there. If you go to the Black press in the 1960s, you get Little League, but you get like a watered down version, right? Going through the Louisiana Weekly, they're begging for donations for balls and equipment because there's not enough. If you're in the South, there's just not enough public places to play, right? Davis wants to go to a suburban high school, but they won't let him. So luckily, Fremont's a pretty great place at that time, right, to play baseball. If you look at Fremont now, it's nothing like when Eric Davis was there. But that's, what happens is, as he tells the story, Davis was averaging 20 points a game as a basketball player, right? You get that today in 2020, you're going college. It's not even a conversation. Back then, you should play baseball. Someone just recommended, you know what? You'll be a good shortstop. You don't have a chance to play basketball. You're only 6'3", right? With incredible hops. But that's what we don't get now, I don't think. We don't get the person pushing in the local community guy pushing the baseball, right? So part of it is not necessarily baseball, but then you get the baseball story of Eric Davis. When he goes to the minor leagues, it's a struggle because he's that lone Black player. So you can see early on in the 1980s that baseball's about to come up to a problem. And part of it is you take some of these guys and you put them in the middle of nowhere, and they're the only one and they struggle. And that's part of the history of baseball. You look at players from the 50s and 60s, usually they're like that isolated figure. And a lot of people just can't deal with that. The other problem is that we generally can't control, right? When you have, let's say, Prop 13 in the 1970s in California, which is really to reduce taxes on housing, that takes away money from stuff like public parks, right? You have in the 1980s, the rise of the NBA with Magic, Michael, and Larry, and some other stars like the great Dominique Wilkins. Baseball has, it's fair to say that baseball has stars in the 80s to rival those guys. You have a young Doc Gooden, you have a young Darryl Strawberry, you have Eric Davis, you have Bo Jackson. But what does baseball do with those guys, right? The NBA puts these players on a pedestal. Baseball, we love it. If you're my age, you love those guys, right? You have your cards. I go through the 87s, the greatest series ever, right? And you look at it, and all those Black guys are superstars. I bring that up because there's a lot of guys who just don't get a chance to play. Gary Sheffield would say, hey, Baseball, if you're not one of the top players, you're not going to get a chance. If you're black, you're not going to get a chance to make the team. That's on baseball. The other thing is just a lack of investment, right? Like baseball today, to be able to play, you have to have money. You have to go through that system. There's a kid across the street. He plays in the local Little League, but he also has to play travel ball, right? Like I would love my kid to play travel ball, but I don't have like travel ball type of money. And I think that's a problem that baseball needs to solve. I know some teams invest in travel teams, and I think they should do that. And the other thing, baseball right now, if they want to make a change. I forget his name. There's that young kid who played for Jackie Robinson West, who got drafted in the first round by the Cubs, right? He needs to be the face of your marketing campaign, right? You need to do everything you can to make sure that he gets there, right? Ed Howard, someone put up Ed Howard. I think is it Ed Howard? But he needs to be the face, just like Tim Anderson, the Chicago White Sox. Mm-hmm. If you really care about this, you need to make these guys the face. You can't mess up like you did in the 80s. Even King Griffey, you had a chance, right? You have an opportunity now, 2020, to move forward, and so just move forward.
Right. Yeah, there was another related question in the chat pod around how few black fans there are at the ballparks, and that seems like a very related thing. Do you think that it is mostly driven by, I guess, first the lack of representation on the field, but also the way that players are marketed to fans?
No, yeah, I think it's just a little bit of both. I'd like to see a study done of because look, we look at 47. There's a lot of talk of black fans are there. I'd like to see like when they stop going. I know a lot of fans, if you look at Detroit, they just wouldn't go because of those ill feelings of how long it took to get like a Willie Horton on the team, right? And so, you'd show up with the Indians where Cleveland was in town, but you wouldn't necessarily show up for the Tigers and just how bad you were treated. But I think that's part of it. And part of it is just the price. And to be fair, just in general, it just seems like kids these days, baseball's a tough sport. We brought our kids to the Tigers. It was like Jack Morris, like local Hall of Fame game or whatever. And we brought our kids to the Tigers game. And all my kids wanted to do was be on the phones and tabs. Like, when are we going home? About, look at this, though. Look how exciting this is. So baseball just has a general problem in that. And then when you get the notion that black fans aren't there, and I think sometimes black folks hear that, well, I'm not going, even though the stadiums are there. And it might just be bad relationships, right? A lot of these stadiums are built in the cities with public dollars, and that takes away from the cities. And so maybe people just don't want to show up.
Right. Had another request here just to talk about your podcast, which is called The Black Athlete. I've listened to the last several episodes and they're really fantastic, so I definitely recommend people check that out. So could you share a little bit about the themes of this podcast and maybe what you hope your audience takes away from it?
Right. So I do it with my colleague Derek White, who's at the University of Kentucky now, and he's starting to write more about black athletes. Has a book on FAMU, which is a historically black college, and their football program. And we just it's so hard, right? Because we want to set out and put, like we say, put the history in the conversation. We're historians, and so if there's a modern day conversation, we want to just give you that history. And so like recently, we have a whole special on Juneteenth. It doesn't really have to do with athletes, even though every league was like, oh, Juneteenth, let's talk about it. So we have the history on Juneteenth. We talk about policing and protests. We have a history on, last year we did an episode on marketing the black player, like on Mookie Betts. Like, why isn't Mookie Betts this super, super duper star, right? And how Major League Baseball can do better with that. So we try to take the top subjects of the day and just really, as historians, like work our way, start in the back and then work way up there. So it's pretty much all over the place. Our last conversation was on the noose, right? Bubba Wallace in the noose, and we just did a history of lynching in America. So sometimes it's all sports. The other times it's this little thing that happens, this moment that happens in sports gives us an opportunity to just give a history lesson.
Okay, yeah, thank you. So I think we probably have time for one more question here. So since SABR has many bibliophiles in its ranks, I'm curious if there are any books or authors or other researchers that you'd like to recommend that this group checks out.
Oh man, There's a good book on the Negro League baseball. It's called The Setup Man. I don't think it's not, only the ball is white or anything like that, but it comes from an academic. It's a fantastic book. And I say that it comes from an academic, but it doesn't read like an academic. Sometimes I know some people don't like how academics write. We write to each other, but this one is written for a public audience. It just doesn't, the author, she doesn't pump her stuff up a lot. But her name escapes me right now. But it's called The Setup Man. It's a fantastic book on Negro League baseball.
Okay, great. Well, Dr. Moore, thank you so much. This has been super interesting, and we really appreciate you joining today. And again, just want to remind everybody to check out his podcast, The Black Athlete. Follow on Twitter, LouMoore12, and then also definitely check out this book. I really enjoyed it, so highly recommend it to all the history geeks and SABR. So,
all right,
thanks a lot.
Thank you for having me.
I appreciate it. All right. So we have our final presentation of the day, which is Dr. Roberta Newman, which I see her. She just popped up on the screen here. So I guess one last plug for the baseball memorabilia raffle. So be sure to check out sabr.org/virtual-meetings to check that out. And again, winners will be announced July 26th. All right, so I'm excited to introduce Dr. Roberta J. Newman. Dr. Newman has a professional background in illustration, graphic design, and a doctorate in comparative literature. She draws connections between baseball, advertising, promotion, and cultural history, and her most recent work centers on these relationships, exploring ways in which advertising related to the sport reflects and occasionally creates social norms. She has researched and written extensively on the business of Black baseball, including but not limited to the Negro Leagues, as well as the cultural history of New York. Dr. Newman is the author of Here's the Pitch, the amazing, true, new, and improved story of baseball and advertising, which received the SABR Baseball Research Award in 2020, as well as the NYU Liberal Studies Award for Creative and Scholarly Excellence in 2019. She also has co-authored Black Baseball, Black Business, Race Enterprise, and the Fate of the Segregated Dollar, for which she received SABR's Robert Peterson Recognition Award in 2014. And in addition, Dr. Newman has contributed chapters to various anthologies and published a number of articles dealing with the confluence of baseball and advertising. She's a regular speaker at the 9 Spring Training Conference. A lifelong Brooklyn resident, Dr. Newman is a clinical professor of liberal studies at New York University. So welcome, Dr. Newman.
Thank you. So my presentation, can you all hear me okay?
Yep.
Yep,
We're
okay.
Good.
So my presentation is titled Infinite Power, Infinite Synergy, Major League Baseball and the Marvel Universe. Okay. On September 8th, 2008, a crew of Marvel Avengers did not save the planet Baston Car from being devoured by Galactus, Eater of Worlds. As you can see, Galactus' mighty bat proved to be too much for Spider-Man, Ant-Man, Giant Girl, Storm, Captain America, and the Incredible Hulk. Ultimately, it was the Avengers' super intelligence rather than their skills on the diamond that saved Baston Car with its peaceful and harmonious 8-eyed, squiddy, insecty, parody-looking inhabitants from literal consumption, slaking Galactus's hunger, with several small, sparsely inhabited, but utterly delicious planetoids. Just as Galactus' energy was restored after consuming his planetary repast, MLB is hoping to restore some of the league's energy via a different type of consumption. Looking to boost its younger fan base, Major League Baseball announced a brand new venture on May 5th, 2004. It, Marvel Studios, and Columbia Pictures would band together for what the league's press release called an unprecedented marketing partnership aimed at cross-promoting MLB and Spider-Man 2. Rejecting the initial proposal to place webbing in the netting behind home plate widely across the league, MLB expressed enthusiasm for decorating the bases, pitching rubbers, and home plate with on deck circle with Spider-Man 2 advertising. The basis right there. That event misfired. Perhaps inevitably, the announcement provoked an angry outcry from many of baseball's most ardent fans. Just one day later, MLB issued a press release, this time announcing the league and its partners had decided perhaps the decorated bases were not really the best idea. However, other aspects of the promotion, outfield signage, live appearances, clips on the Jumbotron, and Spider-Man branded giveaways remained in place. Arising from these similarly inauspicious beginnings sprang a beautiful friendship. As recently as 2018 and 19, any number of teams, both major and minor league, featured Marvel superhero nights with all kinds of giveaways. Here are some of the bobbleheads, as well as video advertising, personal appearances, and cross-branded t-shirts and caps available only in team stores and on MLB.com. Get yours right away. More were planned for 2020. Although the partnership may have been unprecedented, the MLB Marvel relationship was just the latest entry in a long-standing connection between baseball and the superhero genre, one which featured players elevated to superhero status as well as superheroes playing the game. Today I'm going to examine this MLB Marvel commercial collaboration and the connection between baseball and superheroes in print and on the big screen from several perspectives. I'm going to provide you with a brief overview of the relationship between baseball and the comic medium from a historical perspective, an exploration of the synergistic partnership from the viewpoint of marketing and branding. Don't worry, not too much jargon. Nothing that I won't explain. More importantly, I'm going to focus on the socio-cultural meanings of MLB Marvel brand partnership and the relationship between comic superheroes and baseball writ large in an attempt to uncover the rationale for the enduring connection. Let me begin by saying this historical overview is not intended as a comprehensive list of baseball's reproduction in comic strips, books, and superhero movies. I know this is SABR, but this isn't a trivia paper, okay? Rather, my history is meant to contextualize the MLB Marvel brand partnership. That said, the relationship between baseball and comics does have a long history. As a medium, the comic book dates back to the 1930s, born as a collection of daily strips that debuted on the funny pages of American newspapers. By far, the most popular section of the dailies, according to an early 1930s Gallup poll. The first American comic book superhero, the Phantom, created by Lee Falk, appeared in 1936, followed 2 years later by Superman, star of Action Comics #1, published by Detective Comics, DC. Now, not only did Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster's Man of Steel fight bad guys, thwart train robbers, and help exonerate the innocent, but he also served as an ace baseball scout. In 1942's Action Comics 50, the Big Blue Boy Scout discovers a young pitching phenom, Stan Dvorak, and delivers him to spring training. Later, Superman rescues Dvorak from the clutches of an unscrupulous gambler and his dame when they try to trap the ace into a game-throwing scheme. Ah, she was a pretty face, that Mabel. Later, and Soup could umpire too. Sorry, guys. Soup can umpire too. Or so the cover of DC's fall 1941 issue of World's Finest Comics, featuring the Man of Steel and Batman at bat, naturally, Robin behind the plate, would have us believe. While Superman, Batman, and their super buddies would team up on the diamond on more than one occasion, they did not do so in this comic book. In fact, they don't team up here at all. They're not in the same comics. That the editor would have chosen this cover image to sell this comic book only attests to the power of superheroes and baseball when teamed together to sell. Which brings me to Marvel. Marvel #1 was published on August 31, 1939, on the heels of Superman's first appearance. The first Avenger to be, Captain America, didn't arrive on the scene until 1941. Rather than fight train robbers and gamblers, Captain America's foes were Nazis. In fact, the cover of Captain America #1 has our patriotic hero punching Hitler in the face. Given his name, his outfit, and his mission, it's not surprising that America's superhero was in that game in 2008, trying to beat Galactus. Okay. Sorry. Baseball played a much larger role in Marvel Comics than an occasional cameo over half a century. The legendary Stan Lee, who along with Jack Kirby created Superman, the Incredible Hulk, Iron Man, and just about all of Captain America's teammates, loved baseball, especially the New York Yankees, being from New York City. So fairly frequently, the big ballpark in the Bronx provided a backdrop for his superheroes' antics. As if the Yankees didn't have enough trouble in 1968, the Incredible Hulk battled the space parasite from the planet Xenon, totally destroying the stadium in the process. Perhaps that was the real reason for the 1970s renovation. A search of fandom, Marvel's official wiki, shows that Yankee Stadium has appeared in its comics no fewer than 29 times. It's a wiki, so the list is not complete. And let it not be said that Lee, the New Yorker, neglected the Mets. Spider-Man's alter ego, Peter Parker's Uncle Ben, being from Queens, was a huge Mets fan. Playing the role of father to Parker, Uncle Ben strongly influenced his charge to prefer the Mets and used the game to teach the nascent superhero the importance of fair play. While I'm at it, I'd be remiss if I didn't pay brief attention to an extremely unfortunate and uncomfortable entry in the Marvel canon. In this 1995 comic book, the Incredible Hulk tries his hand at the professional game. So what's the problem? I think you can see it here. He hides his greenness by putting on blackface. That's right. Betty Ross, the Hulk's lady friend, even justifies his blackface, suggesting that he too has been discriminated, being green and all. I beg to differ with Betty. This comic was as problematic in 1995 as it is today. Unfortunately, as various old photographs of politicians and performers have proven, the Hulk in blackface, essentially ridiculing sensitivity to racial matters, reflects American values of the era more than we'd like to admit. Did I mention this was 1995? Okay. But what are the connections between the Avengers and MLB as a whole? What of cross-promotion? An early example of such an event was the 1987 wedding of Spider-Man to Mary J. Watson at Shea Stadium on June 5th, before a Mets and Pirates game. Stan Lee himself officiated. The Shea promotion was aimed at selling Spider-Man Annual number 21, in which Peter Parker marries Mary Jane in the church. By the 1980s, new superhero comic books, which had in the past eras attracted children to newsstands like flies to honey, were primarily distributed to repeat customers by direct mail. Also on the rise were retail comic stores, but they were most often visited by aficionados of the medium. And while healthier than it had been a decade earlier at its nadir, the comic business was but a shade of what it had once been. The Shea promotion represented a new way to draw customers to an old medium, as well as reminding old customers of their former enthusiasm. Moreover, any real connection between Spider-Man and Shea was its location, Spider-Man being a Queens boy and a Mets fan. As an exercise in synergistic marketing and brand partnership between the Mets and the Spider-Man brand, this iteration was a bust. So what's the MLB Marvel connection beyond the game's repeated appearance in comics, books, and old promotions? Certainly, many baseball fans regard players as superheroes. No ordinary human beings. They display their superhuman powers on the diamond for 7 months every year, with some exceptions. Even the journeyman who floats from team to team, or a career minor leaguer called up for a couple of days, can occasionally send the ball flying into the night with a bat speed faster than a speeding bullet. And look at the Mets' Noah Syndergaard. Please look. Thor, so named both for his Nordic appearance, streaming yellow locks, but also for his close resemblance to the Avenger, whose own superpower involves throwing an object very, very hard. Something not lost on the Mets when they distributed the Thor Syndergaard bobbleheads. And one look at the Hulk, of course, lets you know that roid rage may be at the heart of his destructive instincts, as well as a rather unfortunate accident. But there's more to it. Perhaps the best way to explain the rationale for the Marvel MLB relationship is to look at the concept of branding as it's used marketers. Surely, the Marvel Universe is nothing if not a powerful brand, as is Major League Baseball. We tend to throw the words brand and branding around quite a lot without actually defining the terms. Basically, branding is a way to distinguish essentially indistinguishable products in the marketplace from one another by defining each with meanings extrinsic to it. What, for example, makes Coors different from Budweiser? Here's a hint, it's not the taste. I defy you to tell the difference. Coors is the Rockies, Budweiser is Clydesdale, Coors is nature, it's the great outdoors. Budweiser is Americana, Coors is the official beer of chill, it's getting away from it all in the mountains. Budweiser, the official beer of MLB, is baseball. That's branding. Clearly, the Avengers are Marvel superheroes. They are not DC superheroes. DC superheroes exist in what they call a multiverse. According to DC's official website, its multiverse consists of, the expanse of differing Earths, each with its own unique makeup of superheroes and villains. There are actually 52 different Earths in the DC multiverse. Each Earth shares a few similarities. They all have sentient, intelligent life, usually humans, but other than that, they're very different from each other. So the DC brand is individuality and multiplicity. This is how it separates itself from the corporate rival that produces virtually indistinguishable products, comic books, cartoons, and movies featuring heroes with supernatural power. In contrast, Marvel represents itself as a single universe composed of a series of groups or teams of superheroes under the overarching Marvel umbrella. Each group or team is a brand extension. It has its own brand personality while still being part of a single universe. Big surprise, the Avengers brand personality is American domination. We see Captain America up front in the face of outside invasion. Powered behind the scenes by a one percenter who turns good. We all know that corporate billionaires work for the common weal. A tech genius who gets very, very angry, a former Russian spy, and a Norse god, all fronted by, well, Captain America, What else would it be? Okay, there's a brilliant black man behind the scenes and an African, presumably on a superhero work visa. But it isn't equality for all part of the American myth. We know it's not part of the American reality, but myth is different. And they're allied with another Marvel team, the Guardians of the Galaxy in Infinity Wars, to form a sort of superhero NATO. But ultimately, it's Avengers, the American team, aided by a few September call-ups, that defeats Thanos, who looks like it to me right here, like a pitcher in his windup. I mean, come on, right? And Loki. So what's MLB's brand? And why does it need a brand? It's baseball. I'm not going to make many friends here. I may have my SABR membership revoked. But though there are certainly formal differences, I'd like to argue that MLB is functionally indistinguishable from any major league sport, as you all click off. MLB competes for the same consumer intention and, more importantly, the same consumer dollars as the NFL, the NBA, and the NHL, as well as some other leagues, right? And mixed martial arts, etc. If we can so easily differentiate DC superheroes from Marvel, it shouldn't be that difficult to differentiate MLB from other sports. Baseball means outdoors. Baseball means summer. Baseball means fathers playing catch with sons, as much as I and my sister would like to believe otherwise. Baseball, to misquote George Carlin, is going home. As a league, baseball also means strength, power, and fair play, and world championships. In one word, baseball's brand is America. More specifically, it's a nostalgic America that never really existed. See brand connection with Budweiser. It no longer matters that baseball is not as popular as it once was. Baseball is the national pastime. It's the American game. Buy me some peanuts and Cracker Jack and a bud and bring the kiddies. That's MLB's brand. But the reach of a brand dependent almost entirely on nostalgia is limited. There's no doubt that baseball's fan base is graying with an average age of 57. A look at its top sponsors, insurance, banking, and Roman with its discreet line of men's improvement products, tells us so. So how to address the issue? Change the rules to shorten the length of game? Play contemporary pop, R&B, and rap tunes at the ballpark? Us geezers really hate that, right? Start national games before 8 p.m.? Do any of these things actually help the brand? Here's where the Marvel Cinematic Universe comes in. In order for a brand partnership to work, there has to be a connection between the partners. To see how it works in the case of MLB and Marvel, I'm going to look at the concept of convergence. By convergence, writes media marketing scholar Henry Jenkins, I mean the flow of content across multiple media platforms, the cooperation between multiple media industries, and the migratory behavior of media audiences who will go almost anywhere in the world in search of entertainment experiences they want. But this doesn't happen on its own. There's a third element in the equation. Notes Jenkins, convergence doesn't occur through media appliances, however sophisticated they may become. Convergence occurs within the brains of individual consumers and their social interactions with others. Fans must buy into it, okay? And yes, I know that Harley Quinn is a DC villain, but hey, the image works, right? And one must simply Google Avengers fan fiction in baseball, for example, to see that the game has converged in the minds of certain serious consumers who've cast their favorite characters as ball players. But fan fiction is written and consumed by diehards who need no encouragement to migrate across media to get their fixes. For cross-promotion to really work, it also has to create convergence within the mind of the less fanatically devoted. This too is at play. Look at SB Nation's website, 2018 draft of Marvel superheroes, in which they are tapped to play one position or another based on individual personalities or superpowers. Or MLB's Cut 4's comparison between the Avengers and Friends as specific players, coaches, and front office staff. Such pieces on these popular sites serve to help and then create and then reinforce this convergence. Looking back on the earlier unsuccessful Spider-Man promotions, it's reasonable to ask why the current Avengers MLB partnership might work in a way that these didn't, why it failed to produce any meaningful convergence. Matthias Stork may have the answer. He says, he's talking about Avengers promo ads, saying, condensed to 1-minute market videos, in particular to highlight the team concept, establishing the coming together of character icons as a core Marvel entertainment brand, apparently titled Headcount, Team, Balance Together, and Heroes Stand Together. The film's many TV spots flaunted the reality of crossover synergy as the film's distinctive aesthetics, commercial, characteristic selling of a brand experience in the process. In other words, team. So here we have the result of convergence. Okay, but wait, Spider-Man's an Avenger, isn't he? He appears in both Infinity Wars and Endgame. But at the time of the Spider-Man 2 promotion, he was not a part of the Marvel Cinematic Universe for contractual reasons. More importantly, as his fans know, Spider-Man is essentially a loner. He doesn't often fit in. And although his image has changed over the years, that's the heart of his own Spider brand. Baseball, especially on the major league level, is also different from any other sport that is played by a group of individuals focused on individual statistics. So here we have the formal difference, if not the functional difference. Still, it takes a whole team to play the game. And while there's no I in team, there is definitely an I in Spider-Man. The same is true of the individual Avengers, but in order to succeed, the individual Avengers must team up to cooperate in order to defeat their supremely egotistical foes. Villains who don't know that as a team, the Avengers are stronger together than each alone. So too is a baseball franchise, because as Casey Stengel noted in regard to the 62 Mets, you have to have a catcher. Otherwise, you'll have a lot of pass balls. So let's look at the meanings of the MLB and Marvel partnership. Power, strength, endurance, and a longing for an America that was never really there. Family-friendly entertainment intended to appeal to broad audiences, but with a die-hard base of hardcore fans. And the brand knows the reason that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. While each individual superhero may be the star of his own movie, each team the star of its market, and each elite player the star of its own merchandising and endorsement deals, they're stronger together. Thanos cannot be beaten by one superhero alone, nor can Mike Trout win the World Series without the help of his team. Whether the partnership extends beyond this COVID-shortened season or potential labor wars at the end of 2021 season has yet to be seen. And with the Avengers trilogy completed, whether Marvel chooses to foreground individual superheroes or new groups in its upcoming projects has yet to be seen. And whether the brand partnership actually succeeded in creating newer, younger MLB fans is unclear. That sort of information corporations keep close to their vests. It may, in fact, be just another failed promotion. I tried to find data None is available. Okay. After all, department store magnate John Wanamaker is reputed to have said, half the money I spend on advertising is wasted. The trouble is, I don't know which half. At any rate, in these terms, and in terms of expanding MLB's consumer base, the brand partnership certainly has potential. It just makes sense. Thank you, and forgive me for having to read. I had no other choice.
No, that was great, and I think that based on the discussion I'm seeing in the chat pod, there seems to be a high correlation between baseball geekery and comic book geekery. So I think it was of interest to a lot of folks here tonight.
That's actually my next project.
So we can take just a couple of questions here. I know we're kind of getting towards the end of the night here, but let's see. We have a question from Cecilia. Have you looked at the spread of Star Wars nights at Major League ballparks?
I actually did for this project. I just had to narrow the scope to just comic books. Yes, I have. I'm trying to figure out how that works, though. I mean, we know it brings fans in for those specific nights because they want the bobbleheads. But I'm not sure. For example, I have a CC Sabathia Darth Vader bobblehead on my bobblehead shelf. Yeah, I have a bobblehead shelves. I don't understand. Well, I could perhaps go into the symbolic connection, but in terms of thinking of brand strategy, it doesn't really make sense. On the other hand, it does draw fans in, although I'm not sure there's really fan convergence there.
And I guess based on some of the, the overlapping interests I'm seeing here, did you see anything related to maybe the overlap of some of the markets on the commercial side? Like, is there a large overlap between people who are interested in comic books and people who are interested in baseball?
Yes, I think that it draws the same sort of, I don't want to use the term geek, I don't like it, nerdery. And I consider and obviously I wouldn't be working on this if I didn't consider myself one of them. Yes, there is, but if you made a Venn diagram, it would only be the most hardcore in the middle. The thing is that MLB really needs to get younger. And what it's trying to do is drag those younger fans in, not through comic books, because they really don't read them anymore. It's through the movies. But yes, there is a lot of overlap.
All right. Well, I think we will go ahead and wrap it up for the evening, but that was a really excellent presentation, and I think you'll probably be fielding a lot of questions directly after this, considering the banter that was going on. So great job. I just want to take a minute and say thank you to everybody for attending SABR Virtual tonight, and today's presentations will be posted on SABR's YouTube channel afterwards if you want to go back and watch them again. And you can find the complete schedule and register to attend tomorrow's SABR Virtual sessions on our website at sabr.org. So thank you again to the presenters, and thank you everybody for attending, and we will see you tomorrow.